Hello and welcome to History Lesson 4. Pause the screen and get something to write with and something to write on. Okay, let's begin. So, we're going to start with our knowing more and remembering more. First question, polytheism is the belief in one God. True or false? Pause the screen and write down the answer. Second question, who was the king of ancient Roman gods? Was it Saturn, Tarquin, Jupiter, or Apollo? Pause the screen and write down the answers. Question 3. What buildings did ancient Romans build to worship their gods? What buildings did ancient Romans build to worship their gods? Pause the screen and write down the answer. Question 4. What did ancient myths explain? Question 4. What did ancient myths explain? Pause the screen and write down the answer. So let's see how you did. Polytheism is the belief in one God, and that is actually false. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. And Jupiter was the king of ancient Roman gods. The ancient Romans built temples to worship their gods. And the final question, the ancient myths explained mysterious events. How did you do? So, our learning objective for today is to identify how life was different for people living in Rome. So, you can pause the screen and write down your learning objective. How was life different for people living in Rome? Your success criteria for today is you can identify how life was different for people living in Rome. You can identify the social hierarchy of ancient Roman society. You can recognize the different expectations in three different social classes, and your challenge, you can select and record relevant information to present a picture of one aspect of the past. So if we look at our knowledge organizer, we see that we have our social classes in ancient Rome. You have the patrician, which is the wealthy ruling class of Rome. You have the plebeian, which is the most citizens of Rome, the farmers, the merchant, the soldiers, although women had fewer rights than men. And then you have the slave, a person who's owned by another person and forced to work for them. So let's go through our vocabulary. These are words that you know. My turn, your turn. Power, power, status, status, wealth, wealth. And then these are words that you will meet today. My turn, your turn. Patricians, patricians, plebeians, plebeians, slaves, slaves, paterfamilias, paterfamilias. Good job, guys. So there were three main classes of Roman society. You had the patricians, the plebeians, and the enslaved people. So we're going to go through each one of them in the next few slides. So ancient Rome was made up of a structure called a social hierarchy or division of people into differently ranked groups depending on their jobs and family. So in ancient Rome, depending on what you did for a living and how much money you made or how you were seen in society will depend on where you were in the structure. So the patricians were at the top. They were the wealthy, the rich, the influential families. They had their own land. They attended meetings at the Senate and they acted as judges. So these people were really important. Right at the top, those were the patricians. Then you had the plebeians. Now, the plebeians were the working class, the shopkeepers, the bakers, the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the people who were really hardworking and they helped the country to move around. And then you had the lowest class of society, which was the enslaved people known as slaves. Now, the slaves belonged to others. They were servants in rich households. They were used to build great structures like the Pantheon and the Colosseum. They were laborers on farms and rowing ships. So let's have another look. So you had the patricians who were at the top of society, and they were the most wealthy, they were the richest, they were upper class. Only certain families were part of the patrician class, and you had to be born a patrician. So you couldn't just want to be one and become one, you or voted in. You had to be born into this. All of the government and religious positions were held by patricians, and the patricians were the people who made the laws and owned the lands and were the generals over the army. The patricians were only a small percentage of the Roman population, but they held all the power. Then you had the plebeians, who were underneath the patricians, and they were the majority, the main part of the population. They held jobs such as farmers, craftsmen, laborers, merchants, and even soldiers of Rome. The plebeians had fewer rights than the patricians, and they couldn't hold government positions, and they were not even allowed to marry patricians. Plebeian women had fewer rights than men and were not allowed to have an education or vote. And then finally, you had the enslaved people. Around one third of the people living in Rome were enslaved people. There were two main types of slaves. You had the public slaves called servi publici, and then you had the private. Now, the public slaves were owned by a Roman government. They might work on public building projects for a government official or in the emperor's mines. Now, the private slaves, called servi privati, were owned by an individual, and they worked jobs in the household like servants and laborers on farms. So you have the three social classes. So what you're going to do is you're going to use the information that we had on the previous slide to create a fact file for each social class. So you're going to write the name. So you would write patricians. Then you're going to describe them using the information that you saw before. So they were Rome's wealthy ruling class. The patricians belonged to certain families, and we know that you couldn't marry outside of the patrician. So patricians had to marry patricians. Okay. What were their jobs? So we know that they led the army. What were their rights? What were the proportion of the Roman population? We know there were less patricians than there were plebeians or slaves. Okay. So what you're going to do is pause the screen so that you can identify the headings that you need to use. And then you're going to go to the next screen in a second and pause that screen so that you can use that information to write your headings. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next screen for you. Pause the screen and start your fact file for the patricians. Pause the screen now. Fantastic job. And then you're going to do the same thing for the plebeians and then the slaves. Remember to pause the screen and then you can go back if you need to. Do we have any of these social classes today? What do you think? So here we have the members of Roman society. Roman families, the oldest male in the home was legally responsible for the actions of the member of his family. He was called the paterfamilias. He decided who his children would marry and issued punishment for any family member that disobeyed him. Families would have a light breakfast, work in the day until about 3 o'clock, and have a large meal in the evening together. Is this the same today? What do you think? Pause the screen. And then with Roman education, wealthy boys were taught by private teachers. They would learn Latin, which is the Roman language, and maths. Poor children were taught to carry out trades and household jobs. Females were rarely educated but taught household jobs. Do you think this is the same today? Pause the screen and think about it. So let's now compare ancient Rome today. In your books, what you're going to do is you're going to write a paragraph to answer each question. Ensure you write at least three differences. So the first one is, how is family life different today to what it was like in ancient Rome? So we know that during ancient Rome times, the oldest male in the family would be legally responsible for the actions of the members of the household. But nowadays, families today, you don't have a specific person who's legally responsible for the actions of the member in his family, and they're not called paterfamilias. You might have your parent who's responsible, or you might have a carer who's responsible. You may live with your grandparents who are responsible. Okay? And you may not have someone in your family who decides who is married, and you may not have somebody who issues punishment, because we have the law system, don't we, that issue punishment on people who break the law. And then two, how is education different today to what it was like in ancient Rome? So here's some sentence starters for you. During ancient Roman times, only wealthy boys were educated, and girls were rarely educated. They were taught household chores. However, today, boys and girls are educated no matter how rich or poor they are. Okay, so what you can do is have a look at this slide, take your sentence starters, and then go onto this slide and complete your sentences. Remember to pause the screen and go back and forward if and when you need to. Pause the screen. So that's the end of our lesson now. So what I want you to do when you finish your fantastic sentences is to go over to Purple Mash and complete your 2 quiz for our history session today. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.